Hey, good evening, everyone. I'm City Manager Deb Fang, and I want to thank you all for being here tonight. I hope that you walk away from this community forum having learned a little something that you can use in your daily life. I also want to thank our City Council members for their continued support in this effort. That includes Mayor Stephen Scharf, Vice Mayor Darcy Paul, Council Member Rod Sinks, Council Member Leong Chow, and Council Member John Willey. I really thank them for their support with these community forums. Today, our guest speaker is Dr. Shaun Fletcher. Dr. Fletcher is an assistant professor at San Jose State University in the School of Journalism and Mass Communications. He also serves as the board chair member on diversity and inclusion for the Public Relations Society of America, Silicon Valley. Dr. Fletcher earned his doctorate in intercultural communication from Howard University, a Master of Arts in Interpersonal Communication from the University of Central Florida, and a Bachelor of Science in Public Relations from San Jose State University. Tonight's forum will help everyone gain a deeper understanding of the concept of diversity, along with reflecting on the personal role each of us play in creating a more inclusive social and civic environment. Additionally, the session will address strategies for reducing barriers and bias and encourage an inclusive mindset in the workplace and throughout our community. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce tonight's moderator, Mr. Jim Delia. Over to you, Jim.
Thanks, Deborah. And welcome, Dr. Fletcher. Great to see you again.
Thank you, likewise.
And welcome to each of you participating in this forum this afternoon. You know, this topic of implicit bias can feel somewhere between awkward to absolutely uncomfortable for many of us, myself included. Yet, it's something that impacts all of us at work, in our community, and in our country. I've spent a little bit of virtual time with Dr. Fletcher, and I know that you're going to find him to be very open, thoughtful, and engaging. Most importantly, I think you'll all appreciate the important content and insights that he's going to share with us. So appreciate you being here. Here's the format. We're going to listen to Dr. Fletcher for about an hour. We may do a little bit of, he and I may do a little bit of Q&A as we go through. I'm here as your moderator to help guide the discussion. And most of your interaction we'll be looking for in the latter part of the session here. So hoping that each of you will be thinking about questions that you may have for Dr. Fletcher. I'll be channeling your questions to him along the way and also be keeping track of the time. So the plan is to go till about 6 o'clock. We'll kind of see how it goes. We can go a little bit longer if there's some interest. So again, if you're not familiar with Zoom and Zoom Webinar, if you could find the Q&A tab at, I believe it's at the bottom of your screen. I'll do the best I can to work in your questions. So right now I want to encourage everyone to tune in and to welcome Dr. Fletcher. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm excited. I'm excited to dive in to this content because it's truly no more important than it's ever been for us to sit and have an honest dialogue and a moment of reflection amongst diverse groups. Again, we're in a format to where we cannot see each other, so there will be a critical imperative that we reflect genuinely. As you're listening through to the content, again, I am a professor, as City Manager Deborah mentioned, I am a professor, so I will move into teacher mode. So I implore you to lean into it. I'm appreciative that you all are joining. It says something about yourself, and it says something about how seriously you're taking this subject matter, but also the world and society around us. We do, for a number of different reasons that I'm going to talk about throughout our time together, I cannot stress enough in conversations that I've had with different groups and different leaders, I cannot stress enough just how important this conversation is, but more so that the way you may be thinking and the way you may be feeling, you're not alone. I can vouch. You're not alone in it, and it spans the gamut. So, Jim, I'm looking forward to dialoguing with you throughout. I'm looking forward to getting a few questions coming in so we can take some of those as we move through. But right now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to share my screen with you, and we're going to walk through some slides. And as I typically do, as I'm having this conversation with different groups, if you're anything like me, you value not just the verbal, but you also value visual in terms of learning. That's the type of learner I am. So I'm going to give you that opportunity. So again, as I mentioned to you, I'm always encouraged when I see the numbers that we see who signed up for sessions like these, because again, keep in mind that when you saw my name, when you saw my credentials, when you saw who is putting this session on, when you saw Jim as the moderator, when you popped on and you saw my face, thoughts came to mind, feelings came to mind. We all have those initial feelings. And any feelings that you may have had about someone with my profile, someone with Jim's profile, someone or cities or political entities, as you may view them, who are delivering sessions like these, oftentimes we will jump to a conclusion and we will frame our listening session and how much validity we give to it based upon it. So I'm going to ask as we move forward that you suspend those. We will talk about them and what those mean and what they look like and how they impact us. But I'm just going to ask that you suspend those even as we move forward. So we move forward with positive intent. One other caveat as we move forward. I don't call these trainings. These are sessions. These are workshops, because trainings typically, and I'm sure many of you have been through trainings, they usually denote that we're going to come out the other end of it with a toolkit of sorts, that we will have learned something that allows for us to go and say, I'm not biased, or allow us to go and be certified towards something. Social issues and issues of identity, issues of privilege, issues that lead into bias, those are lifelong journeys that we take. So I'm going to ask that you also maybe slow your expectations a bit as to what the takeaways and the objectives are for these types of sessions around implicit bias, but in particular, dealing with subjects around injustices, racial bias, social bias, gender bias, so on and so forth. So we're going to talk about a lot. I'm going to ask, grab your pencil, your pen. We're in Cupertino. Grab your iPad Pro if that's your thing, so you can take as many notes as you can. And again, I'm also going to challenge you to listen with positive intentions. Listen also with the intent to possibly be altered. Maybe alter your opinion. New facts, and we'll talk about that as well. New information is something that allows for us to challenge our biases. It allows for us to bring them to the surface and no longer be unconscious. So you've heard implicit bias referred to a number of ways, and unconscious bias is also that. And again, as I asked you, and I said I'm going to challenge you, I want you to reflect. I cannot ask you that because we're not face to face, but I'm going to ask you to reflect on how you're feeling right now. During my preamble of sorts leading into this, and also what you heard from City Manager Deborah, and you heard from Jim, and you heard about and what you know about implicit bias, I want you to reflect on how you're feeling right now. What emotions are you bringing to this session? Are you cynical? Are you hopeful? Are you frustrated with what's going on in the world today? I want you to get an adjective in your head, in your mind. And I want you to think of that. If you need to write it down to remember it, think of it and write it down, because it's important to know what emotions we're bringing to these types of subject matters. Because we're going to do deep introspection and deep reflection, and you need to have a baseline, a basis for comparison. So be thinking about how you're feeling. And just as I talk about baselines, I've talked with many other groups, and who doesn't love a good word cloud? I put together some of the thoughts that I've gotten from other groups when I've asked them the same question. How are you feeling going into a session around implicit bias, knowing what subjects we could talk about? You don't know what I'm going to talk about. You may have thought coming into it that this is a Black man. Of course, he's going to talk about Black issues. Of course, he's going to talk about Black Lives Matter. Of course, he's going to talk about Breonna Taylor. He's a Black man. Again, what feelings we bring to these sessions allow for them to raise below the level of subconscious/unconscious, so we can then deal with them. So these are many of the different adjectives that have been thrown out there in the last couple of months of me meeting with groups. And the good part about it is that in typical word cloud fashion, the largest text is the most frequent that I've received: hopeful, curious, open. I ask that you lean into that as well. But if you don't skew to that side of positivity, embrace that as well. And we can deal with it. We can talk about it. All right. And again, as I ask you to consider what's going on right now, we cannot ignore what's going on around us. These are many of the conversations that we have and avoid. I ask you again as a point of self-reflection. I want you to ask yourself, how comfortable am I having conversations around issues of race and social justice? Think about that. If we were face to face, I'd ask you to tell me, I should say. I'd ask you to rate yourself. But since we're not, I'm gonna ask that you write that down. If you had to rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being extremely uncomfortable talking about it, and 10 being I'm a whiz at it, I'm great at it. Rate yourself. Where are you? 1 to 10. And I'm going to ask that you keep that in mind as well as we move forward and we talk about these issues and how we learn about who we are and how they show themselves, not just at home, but in the workplace as well. And then I'm going to continue to ask you to reflect back on how you rated yourself, because oftentimes we overrate ourselves until we get into said conversations. All right. And knowing where you are is also important so we can build upon that. But we're in an environment right now where we have a very hotly heated, polarized election season. And race is at the forefront of that. We can't ignore that. Gender issues are at the forefront of that. Speaking of which, we just lost a champion for said issues in Ruth Bader Ginsburg. That is also a topic of conversation that oftentimes will come up. And how do you deal with it? Roe versus Wade usually is attached to Ruth Bader Ginsburg's conversation about her. Not too long before, we lost John Lewis. That was a similar lightning rod conversation piece that many avoided because they weren't really comfortable talking about it. The other night, sans the fly who stole the show, we had a conversation during the vice presidential debate that largely surrounded race and gender. It not only surrounded race and gender, it surrounded privilege and how that intersected and how that interacted with the entire political process. And if you watched any of the commentary shortly thereafter and the next day and in the media, much of it did not center around the issues. It centered around many of these different social and racial issues that many struggle with. The last couple that you see lining the bottom, kicking off the NFL season, we saw a show of unity in the first game between the Kansas City Chiefs and the Houston Texans. They had a show of unity. There was no flag. There was no kneeling. It was purposeful, and they still were booed. It's a conversation that many didn't want to have to get to the heart of why this is the case. We have a Supreme Court confirmation hearing that is underway right now with Judge Barrett. Race is at the center of that. Gender is at the center of that. I watched a bit of it today. The Breonna Taylor grand jury verdict that came down. You saw marching in the streets. You also saw an issue of class. I'm laying out some of the different antecedents that lead to our bias. Social identities, which we'll talk about in a second. We saw the former Minneapolis police officer. We saw him leave jail on $1 million bail, which then ushered in the conversation about privilege, about cash bonds, about the disproportionality of those who are able to pay it and those who aren't. Those are sensitive conversations to have. How we lean into those conversations, whether we avoid them or whether we feel comfortable enough to unpack who we are and some of our biases to lean into them, oftentimes will determine how we move forward productively in conversations, not just in the workplace, but also at home as well. And dare I say, many of the conversations that we've had that are difficult are at home. And I'll say this as a personal, somewhat anecdote, because I put this on myself as well. I rate myself fairly high in having these conversations. It's kind of what I do. Until my 7-year-old daughter asked me why so many Black men were dying. Wasn't ready for that. I cried a little bit. after we talked, because I had to put on a good face, strong face, reassuring face. But she asked me why so many Black people were dying, because she saw me talking about it on television. And if you've never felt ill-equipped to have conversations about race and social justice and inequities in our society, try to have an adolescent come and ask you to explain it. So I had to bump myself down a bit as to how well I thought I had a comfort level in talking about these subjects. So again, for every rule, there is an exception. That is why I ask that you lean into it. And one of the things that you will learn more about, and that is sort of a precursor to leaning into these conversations, is to have a case for it and to understand why it's even important to have these conversations, but also to understand when you move into it, what's your motive, but what's the other person's motive as well. So understanding dialogue versus debate is important. I've had so many conversations that turned into debate that should have been with a pure dialogue or dialectic motive. I want you to ask yourself as we move forward, when we're talking about our biases and we're talking about the different things that lead into our bias, stereotypes, media portrayal, so on and so forth. When you are engaging with a group that you may be unfamiliar with, that you may see on television, that you may see caricaturized, do you steer towards debate? Let's weigh the merits of it. We're in a meritocracy, right? Do you steer towards the debate side of it? Let's talk about this Black Lives Matter. Are you talking about it as a concept, or are you talking about the organization? Because I don't deal with that organization. And you have a debate that never moves into dialogue. And then, as we typically do, we retreat to our respective sociological corners. So I want you to think through that as well. And again, I'll invite you, as you know, we try to be as engaging and interactive as we possibly can. If there's a slide or two that you'd like, that you want to somewhat sit with on your own time, feel free, take a screenshot. I'm okay with that. I probably shouldn't say it, but I'm okay with it. Feel free. This is an educational experience. Also, sometimes we have to even understand the case for racial equity and inclusion. And this is not just a personal case, this is also a business case as well. As many of us are walking out or clocking out, just as you were logging on to this session. We have business leaders, I'm certain of it, who are listening right now. Why should you care? There is typically one of three reasons that I usually say. There's a legal case, there's a business case, and there's a moral case. Oftentimes, dealing with issues of racial equity and inclusion, it's usually positioned to us punitively. That if you don't follow these prescriptions, or if you don't follow these policies, or if you say this, or you step on this communication landmine of sorts, as I call it, we could be sued. So you're given the legalese behind it. And we've seen that there's clearly a business case. We see it in commercial, we see it on television, we see it in ads. That many of the cases in our respective communities, and again, I'm not simply talking about Black Lives Matter issues, although it's important. Make it specific to yourself. Issues that have plagued your communities, your social identities, gender, race, ethnicity, ability, disability, so on and so forth. We've seen times to where, when it's convenient, that we start to see ads about it, press releases about it. We start to see statements about it. That's the business case, because you have a set of core stakeholders that you need to keep engaged. But I'd like to appeal to the moral case of it all, both organizationally, but also as people. And we're going to steer towards more as individuals, reflecting upon ourselves before we move too far into the workplace. That will be a sliver of this, but more so I'd like to focus on you. There is a moral duty on behalf of organizations to provide an environment where individuals are treated with dignity and respect, and where there is equality of treatment and opportunity for all. This duty is shared by everyone within the organization, though managers clearly and leaders must clearly take the lead in shaping the culture of the organization. I say that Because again, there will absolutely be a moment to where you find this showing itself in the workplace. But even personally, as I gave my anecdote about me having conversations with my daughter and other individuals in my life, the moral obligation to care about it. I could not abdicate. I had to lean into these conversations. Because if I didn't have it with her, if I didn't have it with my colleagues, if I didn't have it with my friends who said something out of line, who's going to have it? The cycle continues. It gets perpetuated. So more on who we're bringing to the world. I like to take an inside out perspective to talking about bias. Hence why I said, take notes. I like to take an inside out approach. Who are we bringing? Because oftentimes when we move into our social circles or we move into our formal business circles, we like to somehow think that we're different people. We're not. The titles that you have, the organizational rules that you have, sure, they change. They change the rules of engagement and we comply with them. However, when you strip those titles away and go home, who are you? How are you thinking? What conversations are you having? What are you allowing to persist and perpetuate? I'm going to challenge you throughout this to reflect from that vantage point, because we can talk about policy, we can talk about procedure, but people set policies, people set procedures. So I'm going to ask that you lean into this particular aspect of it a little bit more than you may have before. But understand that we all belong to social groups. This establishes a foundation from which we'll build and talk about where our biases come from. Social groups are a group of people who share a range of physical, cultural, and social characteristics within one of the social identity categories that I'm going to lay out for you here shortly. Today, we're focusing more so on social identity groups and the social group membership typically included in discussions of social justice and oppression. So let's break that down further. As human beings, we're made up of socially personal and social identities. And it's important to understand what the two mean. Personal identities are defined as those identities that we get to choose. If you're taking notes, circle that. We get to choose them. They are related to our interests and hobbies or are related to the things we like. You may be a fan of music. You may be a jogger. You may be a runner. You may be an employee of a company. You chose those things. Personal identities. Key point, the last sentence there, is that these are not related to a history of any group, our groups, your groups, fighting for our rights because we have been discriminated against because of said identity, like racism, like sexism, like ableism, xenophobia, so on and so forth. Now, here's where bias, stereotypes, conflict rears its ugly head when we move into our social identities. Our social identities are defined as those identities that are related to a history of discrimination, oppression, or having more power, privilege based solely on where we fall on that identity category. For example, these include race, ethnicity, gender, religious identity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic class, age, ability, disability status, immigration, citizenship status as well. And many people may say, well, isn't immigration status a choice? Not always. No, it's not. If you've been following any of the conversations over the last year or so around immigration, you'll realize, just as we'll talk about with religion, many of us are socialized into our religion. We carry with us what our parents, our grandparents did, much like political affiliation as well. We carry those with us. So many would contest and challenge when someone may say, you chose your status. No, I didn't choose to be born in America. I'm proud that I am, but my parents came here. And my parents birthed me here. Just as many of you, just as many that we may come into contact with who may find themselves in a heated debate to say, you are in that position because you chose to. You're in a marginalized, disenfranchised group because you chose to. Challenge that. Moving forward, talking a little bit more about social identity. These are some characteristics of it. They are multiple in nature. They operate simultaneously. I'm Black and I'm a male. Two identities, social identities. They're interconnected as well. They change. You ask the questions of, are these identities fixed through our lives? These are characteristics of assessing social identity. Ability, for some, that status can change. Nationality can change. So from the standpoint of understanding the different characteristics of it, it's important to even know just how flexible, just how in many ways, how concrete some of our identities are. Those usually are at the heart of some of the most heated, contested sociological and societal and civic debates and arguments that we have that end up pouring themselves out in the streets of America and internationally as well. They revolve around the identities that we cannot change, that are usually the sources of marginalization, disenfranchisement, and ism, as the definition says. So one thing that I find, and this is one that I really invite you to take a screenshot if you choose to, and also spend some time with this on your own. It's important to understand our social identities. Because if you look and reflect back on that earlier picture slide that I showed to show a little bit of what's going on in our society right now, you can look towards each of these identities that are dividing lines between those involved. Race, ethnicity, gender, economic class, ability status, sexual orientation, religion, age. And some of the examples are at the bottom of it, if you choose to fill this out on your own. But when you go a little bit further, and on the horizontal axis that you'll see, asking yourself, which of these identities are you most aware of? Which do you think about the least? That's starting to move into the privilege conversation. Which gives you the most privilege? And we'll define privilege a little bit. I won't go too far into it. Again, like I said, this is a lifelong journey. I'm not going to force it all within the time we have together and overload you. Which do you feel limit your options, access, and or rewards per the societies and the circles that you run in? Which would you like to know more about? Which makes you most comfortable? Which has the strongest effect on the way you see yourself? Which has the greatest positive effect on how others see you in your mind? And which has the greatest negative effect on how others see you? And again, as a point of reflection, and I will go through this exercise myself, but as you're listening to me, I invite you to consider this as well. What social identity grouping are you most aware of? For me, it's I'm Black. I'm African American, because that's what people see before I can open my mouth and dissuade them of any biases that they have. Before you can read my bio and think differently of me, or before you can read my titles, or before you can converse with me and realize that he's not who I thought he may have been. They see my skin color. The social identity grouping that I think the least about is being heterosexual in society. Because society rarely asks me, why am I holding hands with my wife? They don't ask me that. They don't give me funny looks when I go down the street. I don't have to have an awkward conversation with my parents when I said I'm going to marry a female. Society doesn't make me think about it. So I think about it the least. That then moves into privilege conversation. Which gives me the most privilege? Besides, again, being heterosexual in a largely phobic society, it's being a male. Fully understanding, and hopefully you are seeing this as well, fully understanding that while you will have certain identities that are disparaged, disenfranchised, relatively speaking, we all have a privilege. We all have privileged identities relative to the society we live in. Again, I'm talking about North America. If we moved across international lines, these answers may change for you. All right. So understand social constructs will change depending on where they are at play. And the last piece, what social identity group has the greatest negative effect on how others see you? It's the same as number one for me. Because again, when you see my bio picture, I can't speak for myself at that point. I can't dispel any biases or stereotypes that you may have of me. So that is the one that typically has the most negative effect on me. And the amount of stunned looks that I usually get when someone sees my picture pop up or they see me walk into a room to talk about a certain subject matter, it blows my mind. And maybe you wouldn't be surprised. Again, I don't know any of you specifically. I'm just asking you to reflect. But it's staggering quite often just how surprised people are when they realize that I have a PhD. Because it's viewed as something traditionally that is an anomaly within the Black community. So again, the social identity groupings that we have, that they span across different groupings that give us certain privileges and make us reflect on certain things that others do not have to. And the reason why I'm spending time on identities is, again, not just because they are the precursors to bias, they're the precursors to stereotypes, but also many individuals, I certainly didn't grow up with this knowledge. They don't fully understand just how many identities we have to negotiate.
Shaun?
And not all are created equal.
Shaun, can I jump in real quick?
Go ahead, Jim.
Listen, quick question here. I mean, and first observation. I mean, you're talking about lenses, right? These are lenses that we look at each other and we're seen. And it seems like there's another lens there. And maybe this is, I just want to get your comment on this. Mm-hmm. Our identity also affects the way we look at others, right? Mm-hmm. We look at each other through our various lenses too. And a question came up from somebody else here mm-hmm. around family status. Is that also a social identity? You know, married, single, parent, single parent, perhaps. So anyway, got two questions to throw at you there. Tell me.
So anything that either through socialization or otherwise, you're not somewhat brought into. Now, again, that's why I said it changes across international lines. Arranged marriages are different.
Right.
Dowries are different. But in North America, traditionally, those are viewed as choices that we have. So those would then fall into our personal identities in terms of choice. Now, again, that's where social and personal identities are ripe for dialogue, because just as I mentioned about citizenship status, many would want to debate that. But then unpacking just how impacted people are as a result, as it relates to family status, and in particular married status as well, because we know how North America typically views these identities as they intersect with our marital status. In particular, young women who are not married. We know how society in North America tends to put certain stigmas on those groups. But by definition, those would be viewed as personal identities, not associated with a history of oppression, marginalization, disenfranchisement. Hopefully that answers the question. So as we move forward, and Jim, feel free to jump in. It's a great question. Any question you want to ask before I move on?
No, all good. Keep rolling.
Perfect. I appreciate that. And please keep the questions coming. And these are great points of dialogue as well as we leave each other when this session is over, for you to sit and talk about, for you to sit and talk through, because usually the source of a question, there's some reality, some lived experiences there. So I'll encourage you throughout to keep having those personal conversations as we move forward. Another reason why I asked you to start with is, how comfortable are you having those conversations? Hopefully you're feeling a bit more equipped, even if you're not overly comfortable yet, to have those conversations. We're trying to equip you to deal with those. So let's talk about bias.
Shaun, I'm at a 5 now. Let's see if we can move to like a 5.5. How about that?
I can deal with that. I can deal with that. Let's tip the scales in a positive way. So let's see what this does. So understanding our bias. A lot of people ask, what's the difference between stereotypes versus bias? A stereotype is a conventional, formulaic, and oversimplified conception, opinion, or image. One who stereotypes generally thinks that most or all members of a group, in particular, this definition says ethnic or racial group, are the same. Now, bias is a preference or an inclination, especially one that inhibits impartial judgment. The use of bias is more subtle, hence unconscious, implicit. Often it is evident through the addition of qualifiers or added information to spoken statements. I'm sure you've said it before. I've said it before. You've seen a nurse that was a male and you had to say male nurse, as though that was somehow an aberration, an anomaly. It was unusual that a male can be a nurse, or a female doctor. I've heard that many times in my social circles. But yeah, I had a female doctor. Well, you had a doctor, not a female doctor. Stereotypes. All Asians are good at math. I still have students on the college level who think that way. Asians are good at math. Some of my students of Asian descent, we've had these conversations, and they come out and say, let me preempt anybody who may think I'm good at math and put me in their groups. I'm not. The mere fact that they feel the need to say that speaks volumes. It goes for ageism as well. Baby boomers. And oftentimes these, remember the legal, business, and moral case. Baby boomers. We can't hire someone of that generation. Too many issues, too many health issues. They're too close to retirement. Ageism. Social identity, ageism. These are all things that lead into stereotypes, and then when they are placed on other larger groups, that then leads into many of the different biases and many of the different issues that we have seen in terms of inequities, not just inside our workplaces, but outside of our workplaces as well. And before I go too far into that, let's talk a little bit about how the brain works a bit. Unconscious or implicit bias, those are usually two of the terms that you see. Understand that every human being makes immediate, snap decisions about new people or things. So if you're feeling guilty about that, your brain is wired that way. It's mapped that way. It is purely instinctual. And it happens faster than we can comprehend. Some stats say as quickly as 30 milliseconds, not seconds, milliseconds. Because we are overwhelmed with so much stimuli that our brain has to categorize it. And I'll talk more about that in a second. It has to categorize so much stimuli that's going on. And as has been mentioned before, and the data supports it, we still, for the most part, have this nature versus nurture, fight or flight inclination. Neurological science supports that as well. When our body sends bursts of adrenaline when we get scared to prepare us to flee. Our brain does the same thing, but oftentimes it has dire consequences. Once your brain has made these decisions, it will then categorize the people. But it categorizes them based on past knowledge, not new knowledge, past knowledge. Creating a positive or negative judgment. And human nature shows, social science shows that in absence of hard data, we usually skew negative in filling that void of information. So if I don't know something about a certain group of people and I need to make a quick judgment on it, human nature shows that we skew negative typically. This process is called unconscious or implicit bias. And it has a huge effect potentially on how we respond to new people or groups of people. The caricaturizations that you see of groups of people, your brain has already moved into action to categorize them. Because our brain, we use experiences and we create what's called cognitive tags in our head. When I have an experience with someone of a certain social identity, women, men, certain gender or certain racial groups, when I have those conversations, I then will store and we store what's called cognitive tags. So now with those cognitive tags, I will then move forward and create schemas or mental templates to tell me how should I respond in that given situation. So making broad brushstrokes and then actually deciding that I've now just encountered a certain unfamiliar group, social identity, your brain quickly refers back to that template because you cannot possibly make a decision based off of the inordinate amount of stimuli that's being thrown at you to process. Those leads to stereotypes and to our bias. That is how the brain works. So understanding our bias further, our brains use what's called two thinking systems to operate simultaneously. Above conscious, below conscious. The things that we are aware of and the things that we're not aware of. We put people into categories because of that. And then our biases become wired within our human brain. That's why it's so resistant to change. That's why, as we say, as we get older, we become, quote unquote, set in our ways. We're not set in our ways. We just have not challenged these biases for so long that they are ingrained in how we go about engaging in life, socially, and our relationships. And these wirings create a systematic thinking error or biases. It's not true, but our brain will tell us that it's true. And we then move forward acting upon the premise that it's true. That Black people have a certain disposition, or Black women are aggressive, as we saw and I referenced in the VP debate that Kamala Harris received shortly thereafter and leading up to it. If you read the Politico article, fighting that stigma. Certain other social identities as well deal with the same biases. It's not true, but again, if we persist in that thinking process, it will be as though it is true because we create these social constructs and then we act them out. And then as we move forward, we move as though they are true. And then we pass those down. They're learned through culture and experiences. They're contextual. Understanding that we are socialized into thinking the way that we think. Which moves me a bit to talking about this concept of the cycle of socialization. Understanding that these are learned behaviors. How did we come to think the way that we think about certain groups of people? How did we come to think and feel a certain way about different religions? How did we come to think a certain way about different genders? How did we come to think a certain way about ability, disability status? Understanding that we are socialized. And again, this is another chart that I invite you to take a screenshot of if you choose to. This is called the cycle of socialization. And I'm going to ask you to do a bit of a self-reflection here shortly. And the reason why I ask you to take a quick screenshot of it, it's a lot of information. Again, I'm going into full on professor mode so we can learn. Because once we equip ourselves, we feel more comfortable moving into these conversations. We move into these conversations feeling as though we've done the self-work, we've done the self-reflection, to where now I can have certain conversations about issues because I've learned more about it. And we'll talk a bit more here in a second about what that means in terms of undoing some of our bias. We have to unlearn some things. Understand that we're born into the world, starting with the upper left-hand corner, we're born into the world with certain mechanics in place. You are not told to hate another group. You are not told to feel a certain way about a certain gender. You're not born with stereotypes. We're not born with biases. We're not born with habits. We're not born with traditions. We learn those things. We're socialized into them. We're taught on a personal level by our parents, our relatives, our teachers, people we love and trust. They reinforce our values. They tell us, they pass down their stories of what it was like, usually in a different time, usually in a different era, but we rarely qualify that. They tell us about their experiences across racial groups. I can vividly recall growing up in St. Louis, Missouri, in a very racially tense Midwest. I heard white this and white that. I heard so many different racially unproductive characterizations, more than I can recite. So it was difficult for me to unlearn that once I left that environment, because I had a chip on my shoulder. I had a certain cynicism. I had some cognitive tags that I had to deal with. That when I came in contact with a person who didn't look like me, that they weren't out to get me. They weren't necessarily out to oppress me. Some were, but most weren't. But the way that we engage in new relationships, if we don't learn new information, we cannot unlearn old bad thinking that we were socialized into. And as I mentioned, the things that we expose ourselves to, our churches, places of worship, our schools, television. Again, if you talk to a lot of people, ask them which news network they get their news from. Very few people are going to say both Fox News and CNN. Very few. Most are going to say either or. So naturally, you're going to reinforce a certain way of thinking because no new information is being introduced. We reinforce those messages that we learned from our loved ones in the previous set of socialization. Then it's enforced, it's sanctioned. Our communities around us police us. If you say something out of how you were socialized, just think about it. And I'm going to ask you to reflect in a second. Just think about, how were you met from loved ones? Then, loosely speaking, moving into the workplace, when you said something, when you spoke up, when someone had a racially inappropriate joke or sketchy, sexist, misogynistic joke, if you spoke up, those institutions will enforce how you were socialized in a number of different ways, some punitive, others in different ways. And these result in dissonance, silence, anger, dehumanization. This is the results of socialization being reinforced. And for the sake of time, we don't have time to go into all of them, but that's how we become, we reinforce some of the things that we learned, that our dad told us, that our mom told us, that grandparent told us about them, how they are. Not having the personal familiarity ourselves to make our own conclusions. We were socialized into it. And we'll talk a little bit about this, perhaps in a future touch base, but you then come at a crossroad. What are you going to do? You're going to be a change agent, or you're going to do nothing, thus starting over, reinforcing this cycle of socialization. As I mentioned to you in somewhat my anecdotal story, When I left St. Louis, Missouri, I had many different wrinkles that allowed for me to bring in new information to change how I was socialized. And I'm not going to pretend as though I didn't carry some negative stuff with me. Let's be honest. I did. That I'm still working on, hence a lifelong journey. But for the most part, I took the other route. My Matrix fans out there, I took the blue pill. And I decided that I was going to stop some of the negative stereotypes that had been socialized into me, that many of my peers and friends and family who still live in St. Louis, Missouri, I still struggle in having those conversations with them to this day. So I empathize with those of you who may be asking yourself, how do I have this conversation with my loved ones about it? Because I can do it in the workplace, because the workplace has different rules and regulations that help you. But at home, there's usually no advocate that you can lean to. So as I mentioned, I'm going to ask you as a point of self-reflection, again, when we walk away from our time together, I want you to consider what we just went through. Hopefully you took a screenshot of it. This cycle of socialization. I want you to think of one or two memories that you have of the messages you received from parents, teachers, peers, television, media images, other things that you have exposed yourself to that shaped what you understood was acceptable or not for someone of your particular identity. You can select any identity that's a target identity of yours. Being a woman, being a man, being African American, Latinx, gay, lesbian, transgender, queer, so on and so forth. And I want you to reflect and think through, how are you socialized? We get socialized by our messages, by our loved ones. Again, as a male, I was socialized to be tough. We all played football. If you didn't, they looked at you funny. That reinforced that you need to be this way. Often lending itself to misogyny, but often lending itself to a bias for those who don't do it. Also, understanding from just speaking personally as well as an African American. You did not date outside your race where I came from. And those who did, there were funny looks that came their way. There were questions that came their way. There were questions from their loved ones and their parents that came their way and said, really? You couldn't find any African American to date? I've literally heard that before. Those messages reinforce how you think and what you think is normal and what you think is okay. And we pass those down to our loved ones. We pass those down through our institutions, so on and so forth. So again, Jim, I'm on a roll here. So if there are there any questions at this point?
Sure. I mean, number of questions here. Let me pick on one now, and it's relates to the fact that implicit bias is likely tied to the social structure. In other words, I mean, Shaun, I don't know what you think. What do you think about this? I mean, implicit bias, having stereotypes, being racist, frankly, I think benefits some people in the society, social structure. And I guess the question is, if we want to try to change it, how do we confront people that may be benefiting from the bias that's out there in our society? So whoever asked that question, I did the best I could to kind of paraphrase it.
Yeah, if I'm understanding it correctly, I would say it depends on your opportunity and your relationship with them, but also if it is a social structure that's benefiting groups of people, those are totally different. That's why I mentioned those who are in positions of leadership who may have an opportunity to change a system that inequitably benefits groups of people. And we have our opportunity, those of us who are either in leadership positions or will have an opportunity to be in leadership positions. It's incumbent upon us to investigate and to see those systems or structures of inequity and call them out. And then not just do that, take steps towards it. I think we're in an age where we're seeing a lot of performative measures being taken, that there's really no teeth behind it. There's a lot of conversation and dialogue, And my encouragement is to then move towards taking substantive action that's going to give measurable change. But on a personal level, that's when it becomes more difficult, because that person benefiting may be you. That person benefiting may be me. So now having the wherewithal to understand that you are benefiting from it and figuring out and understanding ways that you can balance the playing field within your power, it's incumbent upon us to do that. And having conversations like these, understanding and bringing that unconscious bias to a level of consciousness that then allows you to do it, because how can you really have it if it stays below the level of consciousness?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, if we want to try to influence others, I mean, what I'm taking away is that we have to at least recognize our own biases first, and then draw upon that power and hopefully positive intention to try to influence other people. But I think a lot of what you're saying here is we have to maybe be even more in tune with our own biases, which again, many of them are likely unconscious, for sure. There's another question here, and frankly, I'm not sure exactly what you do with this one, but I've often thought of a similar question here, and it has to do with the fact that you got a lot of people in the forum now, and it's likely, at least there's a view from many, and I'm going to be one of them, that a lot of the people that really need to hear what you're saying, who need to be in on this conversation right now today, Shaun, are not in the room with us. So it's a frustration. And I guess the question here that one of the attendees had is, hey, what can we do with regard to people like that who really should be here? We think they would benefit. Perhaps maybe they need to hear it. You get it. In other words, you're preaching to the choir, potentially.
Well, it starts here. It starts here because we would get a little bit long in the tooth if we were waiting for everyone to come around to join these types of sessions. And I'm gonna to leave with a challenge here shortly, that hopefully those who are empowering themselves through sessions like these will go and empower others. That's why I started with, how comfortable are you having these conversations? Not in general, not over a mass audience, but to the very people that you just mentioned who need to be here, who are not here. How do you engage in those conversations about race and inequity and prejudice and privilege, which I wish we had time to really delve into, but we don't. But how do you have a conversation to let somebody know that you're benefiting off of systems of inequity? That was a heated debate that I've had, and I've long since learned not to have them over social media, but I've had those discussions as well.
So let me try to put you on the spot here, if you can.
Sure. Go ahead.
Give us a definition, if you would, that would describe privilege as a way to understand it. I think you've given us some really, really good, helpful language here as you've presented. But if you could, can you just describe a little bit about privilege?
Glad you asked that, Jim. So let's and I'm not going to spend too much time on this for the sake of moving towards some of the action items here, but understanding a little bit about privilege and oppression. First, we need to understand a little bit about oppression, because we keep hearing that come up. Oppression is a system that maintains advantage and disadvantage based on stereotyped social group memberships and operates on individual, institutional, and social cultural levels. And there's individual, there's institutional, and there's societal. We've seen each of these at play in terms of oppression. Our attitudes and actions that reflect prejudice against a social group, some well-intended. It's not always intentional. It's an individual level of oppression. Institution is what we normally talk about. Systems of governance that we see many of our demonstrations in the street protesting against. Institutional forms of oppression. Societal forms of oppression as well, dealing with culture and social norms, roles, rituals, languages, things that we many times we're not familiar with, so we other them. And we're in positions of power and privilege. We have the opportunity to disenfranchise those groups quite often. And again, understanding that the unearned, unasked for advantages based solely on identity, that's now moving into this concept of privilege. Unearned, unasked for, often invisible benefits and advantages not available to members of targeted groups. As I mentioned, I'm a male. I was born that way. I did not ask to be that. And I did not ask for the privileges in this society that it grants to males. Oftentimes we hear of privilege as white male privilege, because white in this society, as we know, racially speaking, from an identity standpoint, traditionally comes with privileges that are not granted to other groups of color, usually. Male in this society, usually, as we continue to see, usually grants and affords certain privileges that are not granted to other identities, other gender. And gender, again, I'll quickly say, is on a spectrum. It's not male or female. So when I say male versus female, it's on a spectrum. Male is granted certain privileges over the rest of the spectrum. So when we move into and we start talking about different levels of oppression and privilege, understand that privilege is not saying that you didn't work hard. It's not saying you didn't work hard for what you received. You may have, and you most likely did. But it's saying that you were afforded certain invisible, unasked for, unearned benefits that are oftentimes invisibly below the surface, helping move you forward, and you don't even know that they're at play. That's what privilege looks like. I don't know, in a male-dominated industry that I'm in, I don't know how much equity that's giving me in a conversation. Just like I don't know how much equity it's being taken away as a Black man moving into a conversation in a corporate space. I don't know. That is where privilege comes into play. And it always has to be couched within oppression as well, because that's where our social identities tend to divide us, because the original definition that I gave you, it's linked to a group that has had to fight for marginalized, disenfranchised, inequitable histories. So talking about privilege and oppression and power go hand in hand from that standpoint. And since you mentioned it, and I wasn't going to touch on it, I'm not going to fully go into it, but this is an exercise that I oftentimes will do with groups, and I'll just show it to you. It's called a privilege walk. And I usually will make these statements, and I'll ask people to step forward or step back. And where you end up when I'm done asking these questions show, in North America, at least in the United States, the identities that hold privilege. Like, move forward if you're a US citizen. Step forward if you're identified as a cisgender man or not transgender. Step back if you identify as a person of color. Forward if you grew up with both parents in the home, affording you privilege. Again, you did not choose that. Step back if you are the first in your family to go to college, because I can say personally, first generation students typically struggle for many reasons. Not having a blueprint, not having a support system, not having a model. There's a great study that came out of the University of Texas, Austin, around that. First generation students. I encourage you to look it up if you're curious. Take a step forward if you can take stairs and not worry about what entrance to use to enter a building. That's privilege. If English is your first language. You take a step back if either of your parents are immigrants or refugees. You take a step forward if you have credit to get a credit card in the way that our economic system works. Last couple, you step forward if you never had to miss school for a religious holiday that's not observed by that school. It's a privilege in this society. Step forward also if you can hold hands with your partner without fear of being told that you're going to hell by strangers. I have been with people who have said that about same-sex couples. Being transparent. Also, take a step back if you fear walking alone at night because of the risk of sexual assault. Understanding that these are sources of privilege where we live in our society. So again, just to kind of give you a bit of a taste as to what privilege and oppression and power, what that brings to this overarching conversation around bias. Just imagine if those individuals who are at the front of the line after this exercise, just imagine if they're those individuals that you mentioned in your question earlier who should be here but aren't. Just imagine if those are the ones with greatest power distance and they're not here. So hopefully that shed a bit of light as it relates to privilege and oppression, again, without really having the opportunity and the time to delve too far into it. But I had a slide just handy, just in case it came up.
You pulled it out of your pocket there. I'm impressed.
We stay ready, Jim. But again, it's difficult to have this conversation without leaning into that.
Yeah, totally.
To have a moment of seriousness. It's very difficult. That's why, again, I ask you as we move forward, even at this point, go back to how you rated yourself, of how comfortable you are having these conversations. Do you go up or do you go down in your rating? Now that we're starting to lean into some of the nuance of these conversations about race and injustice and privilege, oppression, most do not feel comfortable leaning into those conversations. Did you have another question before I move in and start talking and pivoting a bit about managing our bias?
Why don't you keep going now? We've got maybe about another 25, 30 minutes or so. We can go a little bit past 6 if everybody's willing to hang in there.
Fantastic.
So go a little bit longer, and then we are starting to collect some questions. And to everybody out in the audience, if you do have some questions, I would suggest that you put them in the queue. And I don't know, Shaun, how much more time do you think you'll need in your presentation?
I'm going to go for about another 10 minutes. Famous last words, but I'm going to go another 10 minutes, and I'm going to land this plane and then turn it over in earnest for questions. But I appreciate the questions being interspersed as well.
Of course. So why don't you go another 10, and meanwhile, I'll keep track of the questions, and we'll try to get in as many as we can before we have to let you go today.
Fantastic.
7 o'clock, right? You want to stay till 7, 8 o'clock?
Sure. As long as the questions continue to come in, sure. Why not? Why not?
Just kidding.
So let's talk a bit about who we're bringing to these social interactions, managing our personal bias. If you're not familiar with microaggressions, you should. You should understand a little bit more about them, because either you've been subjected to them or you've done them, or you've subjected someone else to it, whether knowingly or not. Here's how microaggressions are defined: as everyday verbal, nonverbal, and environmental slights, snubs, or insults, whether intentional or unintentional. Again, intentional or unintentional. Doesn't mean you're a bad person if you do. Which communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to target persons based solely upon their marginalized group status. In many cases, these hidden messages may invalidate the group identities or experiential reality of target persons. It may demean them on a personal or group level. It may communicate that they are lesser human beings, suggest they do not belong with the majority group, or relegate them to inferior status and treatment. The most detrimental forms of microaggressions, again, are usually delivered by well-intended individuals. These are individuals who are unaware that they have engaged in harmful conduct toward a socially devalued group. Let's give a couple of examples. We've heard the term, and we continue to hear it. It's been heavily politicized in the last couple of years, but I've heard it well before it was politicized. Aliens, that we call undocumented immigrants, calling them aliens. There is a heavily charged mindset or thought process when you hear of an alien. You do not think of positive things, welcoming things. You think fear. You think hostility. You think of extraterrestrials. That's usually in our society how we denote aliens. But we've heard them assigned to people. And when you then are subjected and reinforced again by our institutions the media portrayals, conversations that we have about undocumented immigrants, that then leads us, when we get into positions of power, to be a little bit okay with the images of cages, with the images of separating parents from their children. Because you dehumanize someone when you call them an alien, as opposed to undocumented. Now, the rest of the conversation pivots when I've now dehumanized you through all of my biases and stereotypes that I spew out in the conversation. And now I've categorized an entire group of people to not have a chance of being viewed in a favorable advocate way. Microaggressions. Where are you from? Those help to perpetuate those you're an alien in your own land. You're not American, you're a foreigner. When Asian Americans and Latinx individuals are assumed to be foreign born, you speak good English. I was in an academic social group where someone said that to the facilitator. She was Latino American. She was born here in the United States. English was her second language. As I mentioned, that's why that is a source of privilege when English is your first language in the United States. Someone told her, like, oh, okay, I get that we're just missing each other, but you're doing the best you can to articulate your point. It was cringeworthy, but again, it was a microaggression. Color blindness, I'll skip to that part because we hear that a lot. That's a microaggression. When people say that I don't see race, again, oftentimes well-intended. But when you look at me, what do you see? Denying a person's race or ethnic experience is devaluing who they are. The social identity profile that hopefully you took a screenshot of and will fill out on your own, that's you. That profile is you. That profile is me when I fill that out. If someone goes down that list and says, I don't see any of these, I just see you, Jim. How are you supposed to take that? Because many will mean it as a compliment, but the person on the receiving side of it, you're now denoting to them that you don't see them. Because that's you. That's who you are. Be very cautious when it comes to microaggressions, even when you're uncertain as to whether you're doing it or not, or if it's being done to you. And again, these are certain ways that you can interrupt, quote unquote, microaggressions. Ask them questions. What makes you ask that? When you ask me, where am I from? What makes you ask that? That oftentimes disarms those. It disarms the microaggressors, the trolls out there. What makes you ask that? Because clearly something prompted you to ask that, especially if there is nothing overt to prompt that question. See what they say. Listen, ask them to say more about it. Ask them to elaborate on it. Because again, I've been in many situations to where folks were overly complimentary of me for having a PhD. And I'm on a campus of higher education. Most have PhDs who are my colleagues. Why me? Why am I the source of adulation? Why are you patting me on the back so much? One or two, maybe, yeah, I appreciate that. But when it happens so frequently, one asks the question, what is that denoting? What are you connoting, I should say? What are you sending? What message are you trying to send? And again, it is not an over attribution or an overreaction to ask those questions. How you ask it means everything. Asking those questions of what makes you say that? Like, I appreciate that, but you do know that I'm amongst dozens of people around me with PhDs. And I've had certain people who will just come out and play the race card and say, I'm gonna be honest with you, I just don't know very many African Americans with PhDs. And I can respect that. We can have that conversation. But presenting it without the follow-up, it leaves a microaggression to do the damage that they do without us having the ability to have the conversation. A couple more pieces. Cultural taxation. This is another aspect to be very mindful of, personally, but also more so professionally. Understanding, and Amado Padilla coined this, it's the obligation to show good citizenship towards the institution or employer by serving its need for ethnic or racial representation on committees, or to demonstrate knowledge and commitment to a cultural group, which may bring accolades to the institution, but which is not usually rewarded by the institution on whose behalf the service was performed. Again, if we're talking about responding to bias, or we're responding to the groups who are usually subjected to bias, understand that if there are few individuals who make up a certain social identity grouping, and you're looking for diversity amongst those groups, whom do you think you're going to lean on the most? But not just that, those social identity groupings who are marginalized and underrepresented in your organization or in your groups usually find it incumbent upon themselves to represent them. Just like I was told as a very young boy being socialized that, Shaun, what you do, fairly or not, is going to directly or indirectly impact the opportunities that people of color have coming behind you. And I took that to heart. And when you overlay that, the cultural taxation, now I feel obligated to represent these diversity calls for groups and task forces and committees, groups that, quite honestly, if there were others to spread around, I would gladly sit this one out. But understand that when there's underrepresentation, many of those who are part of these marginalized groups, women in male-dominated environments, you find yourself feeling obligated to do it. LGBTQ, when now it's Pride Month and we want to do something. Hey, who is openly gay in our environment? Oh, her, him. They find themselves taxed. And now they oftentimes feel an obligation to then educate you as well, and educate those who are not part of these types of sessions or who are not willing to try to understand. I talked to a group the other day to where there was one African American as part of the group, and those who were leading the group, they took it as a badge of honor that I consult him when I'm unsure of how to deal with subjects and questions around race. And he's sitting there looking, and they didn't know that he had already sent me a note saying, Dr. Fletcher, I'm so sick of being the go-to person for issues of race. Why can't I just blend in? That's called privilege. You can't blend in like everybody else because they won't let you, either well-intended or not. And let's pivot a bit as I land this plane and open it up a bit more for questions. Let's talk about reducing bias in the workplace, but also personally. Personally, this is how you change your approach. As I mentioned to you earlier, the way we're socialized and the longer that we lean into this socialization, it becomes ingrained and hard-coded. Collect new information. It sounds very simple, but how do we actively learn and unlearn? You collect new information. That is how you create this cognitive dissonance. You change up what you thought you knew. That's how you shift paradigms. Cognitive dissonance shifts paradigms or ways we see the world, our worldview. But if you get more of the same and you expose yourself, and I expose myself to more of the same, there's no dissonance that's going to be created. So you'll keep moving in the same direction. Divide out facts from your opinions, theories, and suppositions. I've been in academic conversations that when I walked out of them, there was not a fact cited. It was just mere conjecture. Sounded good, but it's incumbent upon us to be able to weed out the facts from our opinions, make judgments based on those facts. If you don't know the facts, don't fill the void. Because as I mentioned earlier, The human brain, human behavior normally skews negative when they fill voids. So I encourage you, again, seek out the facts. Also refine those facts. As I challenged you when we started this session, listen with the intent to be altered, to alter your thinking on it. Challenge what you think you know. Try to continue expanding your opinion on someone's potential. Don't limit them. Don't put them in boxes. And I'm talking from a personal bias standpoint. Allowing for new information and new experiences so I can recognize that there are new opportunities to then change how I view the capabilities. Because let's be honest, many of the biases and prejudices that you hear oftentimes are limiting of a group of people based upon what they think they're capable of. That certainly goes into many of our hiring issues as well. Engage in honest dialogue, even when it's difficult. That's one of the biggest challenges that I have, and I will leave you with here shortly, is lean into the difficult conversations. There is no right way to do it. There is no right way. Oftentimes you just have to say, I don't know the best way to lean into this, but I'm just going to say it. It's not always what you say, it's how you say it. So engaging in those difficult conversations about race and privilege, oftentimes the other person is just as uneasy about it as you are. And then look for media portrayals that are different, of groups that are different than you, that shift what you normally see, that they're realistic, they're positive. That's why I mentioned to you, many of the media portrayals, especially at the height of the immigration debate, I had to turn them off because many of them painted undocumented immigrants as one way. There was no positive conversation. There was no realistic or positive narrative. The media portrayed a group that I was less than familiar with in a certain way. We certainly saw that, those who are old enough to remember post 9/11. We saw a lot of that. To where if you were unfamiliar with people of Muslim faith and you never exposed yourself to anything that altered that massive sort of movement of negativity, you didn't give yourself a chance to see them any different. And that's where many of our biases stemmed into hate speech and hate action that happens on a regular basis. Pivoting to the workplace. Changing your approach. Learn about different people. Learn about the values and beliefs of others in your organization. Oftentimes we will sit next to colleagues for years and not really have a real conversation about what they believe in, who they are. We stay away from them because it's the workplace, right? But how do you truly lean into how you may be feeling or the stereotypes that you have if you never give yourself an opportunity to learn something new? And oftentimes just asking if they're okay having that conversation. I've had many conversations about race and gender and bias and prejudice in the workplace, but the question was asked, are you cool if we had that conversation? And be willing to get a no. And that's okay. Also, identify ways to value uniqueness among your colleagues. As I mentioned with combating microaggressions, we're all different, we're all unique. It should be valued. Watch for changes in the relationship. That'll also tell you if you're moving in the wrong direction, if you've been handling things incorrectly in terms of managing bias. Oftentimes, it may not be said, but it'll be seen. We communicate both verbally and non-verbally. And lastly, but certainly not least, take action steps to implement these types of discussions or workshops aimed at understanding and eliminating these discriminations. These groups typically are just sources of new information, going back to the top of this bullet list. Being a part of employee resource groups, having fireside chats to talk about what's going on in society, about certain hate crimes, certain protests that are going on, socio-political issues. There's an organization that came out, I won't name the name, but an organization that came out the other week and said that they were apolitical. They received a lot of backlash on that because many folks now are expecting leadership within their organizations to not necessarily be partisan, but to not ignore it either, as though it doesn't exist. So the last piece before we land this plane this time we have together, I want you to again get an adjective back in your head of how you're feeling after having had much of this conversation, or listen to me and Jim dialogue and the questions that you've put in and the conversations about privilege and the conversations about oppression, the conversations about bias, and that we are all living with bias, and how all of that factors into how you go out into the world and represent yourself and navigate it. I want you to think, juxtapose that to how I asked you the same question earlier on an hour or so ago. How are you feeling? I want you to think about that as we leave today, because no matter how you're feeling, it's still a starting point. If you're encouraged, that's a starting point. If you feel depressed, that's a starting point. If you feel defeated, trepidation, ambivalent, it's a starting point. It's a starting point to take action. The question was raised a bit earlier, or that rallied around or revolved around somewhat of what do you do when there's someone who's in your social circle that needs to be in these sessions, but they aren't. You become the conduit to it. And again, that's something that I encourage you to take that mantle on. But first, you have to figure out where you are on this action continuum. Are you skewing towards the left, where your actions are overtly? Are you actively participating in things that are against inclusion and social justice? Are you actively participating in those? Are you denying that they exist? As I alluded to the corporation who came out the other week as being apolitical. Do you deny them? Do you stand on the fence? Do you recognize that they exist, but you take no action? I don't really see my place in all of this. This is Black Lives Matter. I'm not Black. Or this is a women's issue. I'm a man. How do you deal with it? Or do you start moving towards the right side, and dare I say the right side of history, and start to educate yourself like you're doing right now? Learning about yourselves, learning about how the brain works, learning about how to navigate some of these biases and stereotypes and prejudices, being able to have a conversation about oppression without just saying the word. You know what it means now. And you can diffuse it to where it's not a scary mystic or mythical, mystic, scary type of buzz term. Do you know what they mean? Start to educate yourself, and then to answer specifically the question, then you move towards educating others. Have you educated yourself enough to where now you can educate other people? And I don't mean leading a 90-minute workshop. I mean, have you educated yourself enough on how you feel, on what your biases may be, to where now you can engage in a meaningful, substantive dialogue with others around it? Not easy dialogue, but dialogue nonetheless. Not debate, but dialogue nonetheless. Do you start to then move towards supporting and encouraging other change agents? And then if you move towards the absolute right, this is when you absolutely start to initiate and prevent. Much to the earlier question, systemically, but also personally. This is when you see something, you call it out. This is when you hear the little jokes or racial that have a racial epithet or a xenophobic or anti-Semitic epithet. You call it out. You don't laugh to go along to get along. You call it out. And especially my leaders out there, when you see an opportunity, where you see a policy that is either unintentionally or even intentionally benefiting certain groups and disenfranchising others, do you raise that to the top of your next meeting agenda and figure out a way that you can do that in a meaningful, substantive way? That's when you start moving from being active participants in systems of injustice or conversations or social circles of injustice and anti-inclusion, to then moving towards taking action steps towards it. And this is the last piece that I will leave you with as we come to our time. I know it's a challenge. Everything that I mentioned to you is a challenge. I'm going to ask that you have the courage to take that challenge. What you see on the left, it's a CAD drawing or a design of a landmine. And if you've ever heard me speak, or when you hear me in the future, you will always hear me say, communication, especially around these hard issues, are like stepping into a minefield. They're difficult. As soon as you think you're taking the right step, as soon as you feel like you followed the rubric, quote unquote, that you've been trained to be anti-racist or non-biased, you step on one, and then poof, a personal relationship is damaged. Professional relationship gets damaged. The image on the right, those are individuals in an active minefield, not knowing if one, that they could have possibly done everything right according to the letter of their training. One false move, boom, it's all over. But they chose to do it anyway. They chose because they realized that those coming behind them could not literally and figuratively safely cross and make things better for those traveling behind them if they didn't do their jobs. So they took on that challenge, the same challenge that I am going to implore you to take on as it relates to who you are at home, who you are in the workplace, dealing with issues of social injustice, inequity, inclusion, diversity, how you may feel about those, and then still having the courage enough to then deal with those and move into start being change agents and having those dialogues with those, as you mentioned, Jim, should be here, but they aren't here. So that is my challenge to you. Again, hopefully you've had an opportunity to take some screenshots throughout the presentation on slides that resonated with you, that you can go back and continue with a bit of homework. I didn't set out to give you homework, but hopefully you will take some of that back with you and you'll continue this journey, as I mentioned, to trying to learn about self, to learn about some of the ways you've been socialized into the person that you are today. So from that standpoint, again, I thank you. I appreciate it. Again, continue to educate yourselves, continue to learn new things, continue to unlearn some of the things that we have been socialized that may be some of the barriers to being these inclusive individuals that we want to be and that we need. So with that, I will stop. Jim, are there?
Well, you know what? We got a number of questions. Can you stick around a little bit longer?
Sure.
Okay, well, appreciate it. Well, let me start off with this, Professor Fletcher. I don't know how other people are feeling, but I feel like you gave me a whole lot of homework. And frankly, that's a high compliment. So really appreciate it. Really thought-provoking. And clearly, I mean, so much of what you're talking about here, you know, it starts with our thinking first, our thinking and our actions first. I think that's a big takeaway. But again, if you can stick around, a number of you asked some questions. So let me try to bring in as many as I can. So somebody had a comment and a question here, and it's around the fact that Cupertino's largest minority groups are South Asian and East Asian. The question is, do different groups experience different types of implicit bias? And if so, what should we do about it? Any thoughts about that, Shaun?
If I'm understanding the question correctly, it impacts different groups different ways.
Okay.
We don't experience it differently because as human beings, our brains are wired similarly. So we may experience it differently based upon our different social identity groupings. Because again, understanding that it's all relative to where our social standings are, geographically, socioeconomic status, so on and so forth, that we may see it impact us differently. Just like African Americans will see implicit bias reflected upon them differently than women, than people with disabilities, than LGBTQ, Latinx, so on and so forth. We will see it manifest differently and impact us differently. And if I had time, I would have gone through some of how implicit bias impacts in the workplace, citing certain studies that have been done. But the research shows us that while it impacts us differently, we are still wired the same. So we will still be subject to the same issues. However, it's just going to look differently per our social identity, not community, our social identity. So even a group of African Americans or Asian Americans, you're not going to experience it the same, because remember, our identities operate in sequence or simultaneously. So an Asian American man is going to view implicit bias or have it impact them differently than a female.
So here's another question for you, and I think this person is looking for a strategy, perhaps. So this person's a woman of color, happens to be Asian American, and has been the target of racism and bias many times in her life. And she's experienced racism from fellow people of color and finds it infuriating and hurtful. Any ideas on how to address that?
The interesting part about it is when we dive into the sociology of it, it would be interesting to know a little bit more about what types of issues this person is facing, because oftentimes within, and as I mentioned a little bit, but I didn't get a chance to go into extreme detail of it, but oppression happens intra-races as well. Usually it reflects itself in issues of colorism, in issues of socioeconomic class, even within certain racial groups. But when you move towards racism, that goes into the conversation about being reverse racist. If I had time, I would have gone into the reverse racism aspect of it and how that is debunked, because as in positions of privilege, you have to overlay power, and you have to overlay the ability to suppress and disenfranchise and marginalize, and oftentimes within marginalized groups, we're unable to do that in large swaths. So that's why I would ask, getting into the nuances of that particular issue, understanding a little bit more about what is manifesting itself, it still could be an attack of oppression. It may not be racism. It may be a racially motivated attack that stems from colorism and some of the isms that we have within our communities of color. But oftentimes how to deal with those depends on if power is introduced, depends on if gender inequities and dynamics are introduced. It depends on if this is personal or professional. Right. Because my advice on how you would deal with it personally is different than moving into the workplace, because you have different dynamics that are at play. Personally, of course, it needs to be confronted. But again, I would be remiss if I didn't take into account the nuances that may complicate her being able to do that. So I hesitate to give a blanket answer without knowing the nuances.
No, understood. And I'm just going to kind of hit you rapid fire as long as we have here with a number of questions. So I realize, should say, much of this is nuanced and certainly complicated. You use the term racism and racist. Another question here was around the term anti-racist. And the question was centered around, do you think that term is losing its power? What's your feelings about the term anti-racism at this point in time?
I do. I think it's become a performative buzzword. I've seen a number of efforts, even good faith efforts, fail badly to have anti-racist workshops and anti-racist groups, because failing to realize that even those need to be inclusive usually then restricts it and reduces it to a performative measure. I was a part of one. I didn't facilitate it. I was invited to one. And what ended up happening is that there was a white male facilitator who was facilitating a session on anti-racism, and there were no people of color who were invited to be leaders in it. And quite honestly, we weren't even invited to it, we come to find out. It was supposed to be a session around anti-racism for our non-POC, as they call it, non-people of color groups. So it was, what we come to find out and why we were so outraged was that it effectively was a white male who was leading a conversation on anti-racism with other white colleagues. So the conversation became very performative. The question begged was, why'd you do this without genuine lived experiences being involved within it? So oftentimes there could be pure intentions and poor execution, and then it becomes a deflated, somewhat hollow, watered down measure that then will be subjected to scrutiny of being largely performative. And I think we're seeing a lot of that with some of the work that I'm doing out there in public and private organizations. You can tell, quite honestly, through having deep dialogue as to whether there's an end game within this. Again, just like this session right here, this is a part of a larger series, which will let you know that there is a sequential strategy towards moving the needle in this area. No, it may not be perfect, none are. But you can tell if this is a one-time deal, which some of the unfortunate sessions that I lead are one time, you can tell that eventually that conversation is going to turn into anti-racism becoming a buzz hour or hour and 30-minute session, and then we walk away and do nothing else about it. You check the box. So my hope is that most are moving towards substantive action, not checking boxes.
Right. Just to ask maybe a broader question, I don't know if this crosses your mind. When you think about 2020, I mean, so incredibly impactful, and so many things have happened, and you covered many of them as far as the issues related to our topic around implicit bias, of course, and racism. I wonder, are we still going to have the same energy next year? Would we have had the same energy last year? I mean, in other words, I think you're kind of touching on this. Is this a moment in time, Shaun, I guess is the point? And if it is, that's great. But what can we do to kind of leverage it to keep that momentum going? Because I've been around long enough to, remember the 60s and remember a lot of important events where people were activated. But I do think that's the question. I'm just curious what your take on that around 2020 and this period in time with respect to these issues.
Yeah, I challenged the group. I shouldn't say I asked them, but it was more of a challenge. And I asked them, I said, be very, very cautious with patting yourselves on the back or being perceived as patting yourselves on the back for doing a session around implicit bias and anti-racism, which we were doing at the time. And I challenged them because I said, did you do this a year ago? Did you do this for Tamir Rice or Trayvon Martin or Sandra Bland? Did you do this for Eric Gardner? Did you do this for any of them? Were you up in arms about those? Did you stop meetings and just have a fireside chat impromptu style for them? If the answer is no, be very cautious about how you will be perceived right now. Because again, this is not simply a conversation around African-American issues. Make it personal to yourself. Is that any issue that comes up when there are hate crimes that take place in the LGBTQIA community, when there are hate crimes in the Asian American community, when there are hate crimes across our different social identities, and then there's one that raises it to national prominence, and it's on a national stage like George Floyd on May 25th did for us, it calls one to ask, where have you been? Because this is not new to us in our communities. It's not new to you in your respective communities. So from that standpoint, I do fear that this is going to be a moment in time. And that is why I challenged at the latter part of the presentation is to find where you land on that action continuum, because that allows you to move forward in perpetuity, regardless of said cataclysmic incident. So my hope is that we will move forward. I would venture to say, just like the NBA and Adam Silver, commissioner, said the other day, I do not anticipate that Black Lives Matter will be on the court next year. I do not anticipate that we will allow for these social justice messages to be on the back of the uniform. Again, I understand business is business, but you don't have to have a long dissertation to let me know what's at the heart of that. We're moving on. And again, I don't disparage them for doing that, but understand the message that's being sent with that. And also understand the message that society is receiving from that is that we've seen enough, we've moved forward, and now we're going to move on to something else. And I fear that will absolutely be an issue post-election. We'll move on to other issues. Whomever wins the election, we'll move on to other issues.
Another question here. Let me see if I can kind of synthesize this. So what are your thoughts about navigating a lot of these difficult conversations? I mean, it's hard. I mean, you and I, we've had a number of discussions, and as I said, I'm at about a 5. I mean, I've got a number of Black friends in my circle, potentially Black family members. It's tough. It's a little uncomfortable. And the landmine was a great slide, by the way, because sometimes that's what it feels like. So I don't know. I'm not looking for permission, Shaun, but again, just maybe some guidance, because you certainly don't want to make things worse. So I think I speak for a few people here, perhaps may have similar sentiments. So any thoughts on that?
So are you saying, Jim, how, just so I'm framing it correctly, are you asking how to approach those conversations, or how not to destroy a relationship? Well,
both. You know, how to approach it in a productive way. And I think you gave us some good strategies here. And then clearly don't want to make things worse. I mean, you know, we talk about language, you know, we're going to be careful sometimes with the language, maybe even, you know, careful. In other words, I might be uncomfortable asking you, you know, Shaun, what do you think about what just happened? And it could be something that was racially related. Anyway, thoughts on that? I don't expect you to have all the answers just because you're a Black man.
No. I appreciate you calling that out, but absolutely not. The challenge that I've seen personally, but also academically, is that understanding and doing your due diligence to understand the motives that others are bringing. Of course, we talk about ourselves. That's what this presentation has been about, is reflecting on ourselves. But understanding if someone that you're hopefully engaging in a conversation with, they are dead set on debating, they're not ready. You can come back to it. Again, there is no ticking time bomb per se that's forcing you to force an issue that ultimately they're not ready for. That's why I mentioned earlier, I've had conversations with friends that did not go well simply because they started off with debating issues. I had a heated conversation with someone. I made a post about, and again, I didn't lean partisan or anything. I made a post just simply calling out the time when the protesters or demonstrators were outside the White House, and then the infamous Bible photo op took place. And I made a post about it, just about the civility of it all. And a person chimed in, person that I know, chimed in with statistics about protesters and their Secret Service being injured. Had nothing to do with what I posted. No one was injured in what I posted, but they decided to engage in the conversation from a debate perspective. They threw in, well, if you care so much about them, you clearly don't care about our Secret Service who have been injured. I made a conversation here, a conversation topic here, and they entered into it from an adversarial debate format, not entering into it with pure emotive dialogue. And sometimes people just won't be ready to have those types of conversations. But again, when you assess that they are, the same way that you just asked me, Jim, is totally okay to do that. And oftentimes disarming another person by letting them know. Again, the elephant in the room when we start talking about race, if you and I are talking, is that I'm a Black man and we're talking about Black issues. Totally okay to say that. in a respectful way to just say, hey, listen, I've had colleagues of mine who just said, listen, I'm uncomfortable as heck talking about this, but I feel like I need to learn more about it.
Mhm.
I feel like I need to. And then they also understood when I got to a point of racial fatigue and I said, I'm tired of talking about this. Let's table this for a while. And sometimes that has to happen as well.
Yeah, so it seems like we have to try to navigate tactfully, of course, a lot of the sensitivity. And it seems to me what you're talking about not only applies to certainly Black people, but people of color in general.
Mm-hmm. And across social identities. Again, I don't want to restrict it to race and ethnicity,
Right.
Because as I purposefully open the spectrum of across different social identities that have had a history of marginalization, disenfranchisement, and inequity.
Mm-hmm.
And each of the identities that we went through, and hopefully those who listened will spend more time with it, each of those have had and will continue to have their time to be focused on. And in micro communities, they're being focused on now. It's just national and international dialogue is about race right now. But typically international and national dialogue, as it relates to social identities, it expands and contracts. Now race is expanding, while other social identities that are marginalized are contracting in national discourse. That doesn't mean they go away. They just expand and contract. So from that perspective, that's why it's important to understand that, again, just think about Black women. Just think about women of color and the dual consciousness and double consciousness that they deal with. Two marginalized, subjugated identities. So again, pick which one that they want to talk about. Pick which one that we really want to have a dialogue on, being a woman or a woman of color. Again, you can't separate the two. However, one will expand and one will contract depending on said issue. So that's why the educational side of this conversation, that's why I went in full professor mode, because understanding these nuances allow for us to know that bias is not just race or ethnicity. It's not. There's more to it than that. And then when you come educated from that perspective, you disarm individuals. That's why I've started many sessions like this, and I disarm people and just let them know, if you're expecting me to give a Black Lives Matter presentation, you're in the wrong room. Because bias is much, much bigger than that. We will talk about it, but it's much, much bigger than that, because that then includes others into the conversation. And now you're not just listening to me talk about my issues in my community and I other you. And now that's when folks have difficulty engaging and finding themselves in it, when they feel othered.
Yeah, and that's why I think your approach, your presentation today was spot on. I think, particularly given the diversity of the city of Cupertino and our community here and our demographics. So I think you're totally right on with all of that. A lot of really great tools. So I think we should probably start to wrap it up, Shaun, because I'm afraid I was joking about staying until 7, but
I may have to make another pot of coffee.
So in any event, I want to thank everybody for participating. A lot of great questions. Of course, clearly addressing this issue of implicit bias is not something that is going to happen overnight. And as you pointed out multiple times, Shaun, Dr. Fletcher, it affects more than just Black people. It's very broad, and I think that was an important takeaway. So I know that you, as I took a lot from Dr. Fletcher's views today on the topic, and if you are interested, my understanding is that the presentation will be posted on YouTube. So the information I have here is cupertino.org/YouTube. You could also go to cupertino.org/calendar for more information on upcoming events. So if you have any feedback or suggestions for future programs like this one, perhaps maybe there'll be a continuation at some point. I also want to encourage everybody to email manager@cupertino.org. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Deborah, and you can close us out for the evening if you'd like.
I want to thank everybody for being here, and thank you so much for your time, Dr. Fletcher, and Jim again for effectively moderating tough content, I think. You know, it's great information you've given us. I particularly liked the one that kind of showed the spectrum of where people are you learning and where are you learning and can you educate others. I'm somewhere in between those two, I think. I'm trying to figure out where I am. But yeah, this is to me kind of just the beginning. And I do want to talk about, you know, there's some questions in the chat. We got some good questions, great participation. And thank you for people who are expressing appreciation for having something like this. I acknowledge we can't answer all the questions today, but there'll be more because we're not going to stop. This is just scratching the surface, I think. But thank you for helping us scratch that surface, Dr. Fletcher, and hopefully we can talk soon.
Sounds great. I appreciate it. I appreciate you, City Manager Deborah, but I also appreciate those who stayed on because I can see the participants. I appreciate it. That just shows the investment that you have in it. So again, I encourage you continue to do the work and continue to find the lanes that we all can navigate in moving this conversation forward. So absolutely, I appreciate it. This was a great time. I appreciate you having me.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Jim.
Good night, everybody. Stay safe.
Night.
Have a good night.